Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from Miami, Florida. On behalf of the Miami chapter for Women in AI USA, welcome to today's session, Ethical AI, a Design Thinking Perspective. It's my honor to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Ingrid Vasiliu-Feltes. Dr. Vasiliu-Feltes is a healthcare futurist who has extensive experience in the healthcare industry as a founder, executive, consultant, and speaker. She's currently serving as the Chief Quality and Innovation Officer at MEDNAX Health Solutions Partner. In this capacity, she provides oversight for all of the quality and innovation initiatives across the enterprise, such as blockchain, AI, genomics, precision medicine, population health, telehealth, medical simulation, and value-based care. She also provides leadership to the MEDNAX Center for Research, Education, Quality, and Safety. Dr. Vasiliu currently serves as the Chief Ethics Officer for the Government Blockchain Association, an international non-for-profit organization, and she's a member of the World Business Angel Investment Forum, where she serves in a senator role and is active within the startup and ethics committees. She is currently a faculty member of the World Business Angel Forum Business School, Division of Entrepreneurship, an honorary member of the Law and Technology Global Online Academy, and she also teaches the Executive MBA Business Technology course at the University of Miami School of Business. Additionally, she's the ambassador for several non-for-profit organizations such as Women in AI, Blockchain and Healthcare Today, and League of Virtual Social Entrepreneurs. So without further delay, I will hand the virtual mic over to Dr. Ingrid Vasiliu-Feltes.
Thank you, Nicole, for that super kind introduction. It's kind of long, but I wanted to also thank you for all the work you do for our Women in AI Miami chapter. I really appreciate all your help, and I welcome all our attendees to check us out on social media. The reason why I chose design thinking for AI strategy as a topic today is because I've spent quite a lot of time over the last few years deploying AI in the traditional way. And although I think we're trying really hard globally and we have a lot of elements of success and lessons to learn from our past deployments, I have come to realize that following design thinking can give unique benefits to all of us when we design a strategic roadmap. So I wanted to share this concept with you today. And then I hope that you have more questions about it and you would like to learn more about it in the near future. So what is design thinking? For those of you that might not be familiar with it, it's a human-centered approach to innovation that integrates the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements of business success. So the first time you see this definition, you would say, well, why didn't we do it in the first place? If it's existing and it's working so well for other industries, why did we not use it for digital technology in general and for AI, so to speak? And I've tried to deploy it for other technologies such as blockchain, and it works really well. So that's why I was hoping that today we can focus a little bit of our attention on explaining why I think having this type of conceptual approach to AI strategy can actually be very beneficial. So what are the elements of design thinking? Traditionally, we had 5 core phases. They've expanded to 7, and I'm going to walk you through each one of them. The first foundational principle is to empathize with all the stakeholder ecosystem. And particularly when we deploy AI, like we mentioned, doesn't matter what type of enterprise, you have to first understand the perspective of each stakeholder that will have to touch any element within the AI strategy that you're designing. If you're stepping over this process and do not assign enough time to this, you will never have perfect adoption and you will never have acceptance of whatever AI strategy you design. So I can share that most people try to skip over this really quick and do not give it enough consideration. So when we say empathizing, it truly means trying to see everybody's perspective through their lens, not through your lens, and try to understand when you deploy that specific AI tool in that enterprise, how will it affect all their processes? Once you do that, you have to also define how will the deployment of AI in that specific organization change some of the processes, because you cannot always keep the same processes and just deploy AI on top. You have to sometimes completely restructure the sequence, the cadence, the workflows. And again, sometimes when we see AI deployed, it's done in a silo as an isolated pilot, and people forget to try to understand if that specific AI tool is deployed, or that specific AI strategic roadmap for one domain, how will it affect everybody else within that organization? The part that everybody loves is the ideation phase. Everybody loves to brainstorm. And that's fine, as long as, according to design thinking principles, you brainstorm, but you also understand the need to prototype, and you need to prototype fast. And you have to also be available and amenable and receptive to negative feedback. That's another part that I see many times in AI deployments, that it takes several months, sometimes up to 15 months to deploy, and no one wants to prototype because of fear of failure. It's really important to prototype really quick and get feedback from all those stakeholders in order to design appropriate, successful, long-term sustainable AI strategies. And again, rapid prototyping and agile prototyping are developed very nicely in other domains. We've just not always done it in AI consistently. We have done it in pockets, but what I'm proposing is that we would have the full AI strategy prototype like that. The second part is then to select out of the prototypes that had the least negative feedback, one to actually implement and then to test. Continuing to improve forever and ever, if you do not get feedback from your stakeholders, is not going to yield the optimal results either. So again, the design thinking principle is to empathize with all the stakeholders, clearly define what problem you try to solve, engage in ideation, but make sure you prototype, select the prototype, and implement and test it as quickly as possible. Now that you understood a little bit some of the key foundational principles, what I also wanted to emphasize, that the approach has to truly be 360, not only for the stakeholders, which is what we just mentioned, but also from an AI strategy perspective. You have to deploy each one of those foundational elements I described for governance, AI governance, for the auditing process, for the risk assessment, for the cybersecurity component. And when you think about AI strategy long-term, you want to make sure you have purpose and sustainability. Otherwise, it's going to remain just a project, and next year it's forgotten, or you have another AI project on top, and you never achieve the type of enterprise strategy that's harmonized, so that you have your AI strategy harmonized with all other digital strategy within your organization. So having a design thinking approach not only helps you have the optimal AI strategy, but also forces you in a way, in a very diplomatic, elegant, organic fashion, to harmonize it with the rest of the enterprise strategy. So although it sounds a little bit more laborious, as opposed to just do an AI implementation, typical the way we're accustomed to, like a very clear project, I assure you that by spending a little bit more time up front, having a proactive, mindful, human-centered approach, you will have much higher adoption, less resistance to change, higher ability to harmonize with all other domains within that enterprise, and therefore we can hopefully achieve a larger scale adoption of AI across industries. Next topic that I wanted us to highlight is that the same way like we just said that we need to address all the AI strategy domains like a 360 approach, there are a few high impact elements that specifically can be addressed with design thinking principles. And as we know, algorithm bias has been on the forefront of every single social media page and in the scientific publication. So I truly believe that by following the 7 steps I described to design thinking, you can approach the bias in algorithms in a unique way that has not been done before. So when you look at traditional procedures and traditional approaches, unfortunately, they're still, even if they're done state of the art, they're done in silos. By having this other approach that's based on design thinking principles, you absolutely can address bias in a better way, in a more optimal way, because you're forced from the beginning to take all stakeholders into consideration. The second element of success, I believe, from what I've observed, is the data repository. It's really important to spend enough time and to follow all those principles when you consider data repository that you will utilize when designing your AI strategy. If you do not spend enough time to have an adequate, validated, standardized data set and appropriately maintained data repository, no matter what AI tools you want to deploy, your outcomes will not be optimal. The second one that I briefly mentioned before is process. No matter what amazing AI tool you will deploy, and no matter how amazing your team is, if the underlying processes that you're trying to deploy the AI tool to are faulty, you will not achieve optimal outcomes either. So again, the design thinking process, due to all those 7 steps I described, will almost organically force you to revise the processes too, and be able to correct before you deploy AI tools to those faulty processes or not optimized processes. And then last but not least, it's really near and dear to my heart, but you want to take the social good into consideration too. If you want a long-term sustainable AI strategy, not just a beautiful piece of paper that outlines a strategy that no one ever follows, it's really helpful, again, thinking about the empathizing with the stakeholders. Society is a stakeholder too when we deploy AI for any organization in any industry. And trying to spend a little bit time proactively, not after you deployed the AI strategy, to think about how can you deploy it in a way that has a better impact on society, or a broader impact on society, or at least does not hurt society, can again not only make acceptance easier, can improve the brand of the organization, and can also achieve the long-term sustainable goals that we all want, regardless of the industry. The next topic that I wanted to highlight is that you can read 100 sources of how an AI strategy is going to look. So I don't think we're all going to find one universal source of truth. But I've highlighted a few elements that I think having as part of your agenda when you design an AI strategic roadmap would be helpful. And again, each one of these is uniquely amenable to design thinking. Thinking about your human capital, I can't emphasize enough how important that is. You cannot just bring a team, deploy AI, and not think about the fact that you need to train your employees. You need to have a sustainable pool of talent that you can deploy to use all those AI tools, right, that you just implemented. So thinking about human capital, you need 2 years in advance to plan for that. You can't just deploy an AI tool and an AI strategy and then think about this. So really important. Don't forget the human portion. Having innovation hubs. Deploying AI and then being stuck is not going to be helpful. You need to have continuous improvement. So having innovation hubs that continually challenge the status quo will help you have, again, long-term sustainability. The other element that I wanted to emphasize is that you need to also have continuous access to new data. If you do not have that as part of your AI strategy, you're going to continuously operate on biased data sets just by not having enough denominators and enough variety that will give you good outcomes. And then computing infrastructures. Most people, because of the way AI was deployed, that you had just a project or a pilot, do not understand the complex infrastructure that's required for the AI tool that's deployed to be harmonized and have good interoperability with all other systems within that organization. So having, again, from a design thinking perspective, if you really dedicate enough time at the beginning to that empathizing stage where you really understand how all the stakeholders in your organization will be affected, as opposed to just the team that's deploying the AI pilot, it will help with this element as well. And then last but not least, I referenced it at the beginning, but thinking about having a state-of-the-art AI strategy has to encompass thinking about an ethics ecosystem. Because when you think about all the elements that have prevented large-scale AI adoption, ethical issues are at the forefront. And trying to have a proactive approach in designing an ethics ecosystem will help all those elements that I described before, and will also make sure that you don't encounter some of the challenges that everybody else has encountered in deploying AI. So specifically for AI ethics, there are a few other elements that we can highlight. And I just wanted to make sure we all share the same definition. Again, you can look at many sources, but I selected 3 definitions for ethical AI that resonate the most with me. And one of them is just defining humanity's place in the AI ecosystem. It sounds pretty broad, but I think it encompasses pretty much everything that always concerns all of us when we talk about mindful AI deployment and ethical AI deployment. A simpler one is just impact of AI on society. And then the more comprehensive one is principles of autonomy, justice, non-maleficence, and beneficence are upheld during all the phases, such as procurement, design, development, and integration of AI. I would also like to highlight that for certain industries, sometimes it's helpful to not use the term artificial intelligence, because unfortunately it has caused much more misconception and myths than necessary. So yes, we do have challenges in deploying AI strategy, and by having a design thinking human-centered approach, some of those can be mitigated. But I think using augmented intelligence would also help a lot of these misconceptions to be addressed. So when we talk about ethical AI, I also like to always say ethical augmented intelligence, because that highlights that us humans need to do our part too, specifically when we talk about impact of AI to society. The next concept I wanted to address is that I believe there are key elements that if you already engaged in designing an AI strategy for an organization, you should be able to design a toolkit, because it's easy to talk about AI strategy and having ethical AI, but it's very difficult for most organizations to actually deploy them in a successful way. So when we talk about having an ethical AI or an optimal AI strategic roadmap, it's not just a PDF. We're talking about how can you actually help that organization deploy it and then sustain it long term with all the improvements and dynamic elements that happen in our organization. So the key elements of success for an AI ethics toolkit would be, it has to be customized to their organization. It has to be dynamic, so that no matter what new tools or other new systems or other new regulatory elements that occur, or any other nuances that are specific to that organization, they can be absolutely assimilated without any major restructuring. And then, of course, that ensures sustainability long term. And like we mentioned before, you wanna, if possible, also give a lot of consideration to the social impact whenever possible. Sometimes it's not optimal, but certainly not thinking about it is something we wanna avoid. You've heard probably everybody talking about having an ethical AI mindset, and that's again a design thinking concept. Changing the mindset, changing the culture is really important when you deploy an AI strategy, because it's not like just going to buy any other technology like an iPhone and plug it in. When you start to deploy AI in an organization, it has profound impact, and AI becomes embedded almost into the DNA of that organization. So having an ethical AI mindset means that you have to have creative confidence within your team. You have to instill that. Otherwise, you just have bias from the beginning. You have to instill the culture of continuous improvement. You have to embrace ambiguity. You can't possibly always know all the outcomes. That's the whole point of having an augmented intelligence tool. And then, of course, the disruptive power of deploying an AI, particularly in unsupervised learning, And it's misunderstood many times, but there is some disruptive power of deploying an AI strategy. There's no doubt. And being mindful of it and being able to leverage the benefits of that and mitigate some of the negative consequences is really important. So overall, the aim would be to create a culture of ethics where autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice are being upheld. I know we're coming close. So I want to make sure that we also, if there are questions, be able to address some of them. So when you think about the optimal design thinking AI toolkit, if an organization was willing to engage in that, you would have a certain kind of roadmap that you would want to follow. You definitely want to provide them a framework so that, like we said, the AI strategy has to be harmonized with the enterprise strategy. Everything that that enterprise does, from how they define their brand, how they position themselves in the market, how they want to retain competitive advantage, how they deploy any other digital strategy, if they're engaged in digital transformation across the board or not, all those elements play a role in how you're going to design your specific AI strategy. And if it's not integrated, harmonized, and synchronized, it will fail. Or certainly it will not be sustainable. It will just be one beautiful project that's being checked off, and then it's not going to have long-term desired outcomes. The second one is you want to provide organizations with a business canvas so that they know exactly what kind of quality metrics and performance metrics would you need to look. Most organizations are not accustomed to, because we've not had enough large-scale deployment of AI. So although the project for a specific pilot has clear indicators, for an organization to be able to measure how has this AI deployment affected all our other KPIs and all our other quality or outcome indicators is really important. You want to help them with an implementation journey map. You want to help them with the culture change. You have to at least have them question, when they define the problem to solve, is what their brand needs to be, and what they want their brand to be, and what is feasible or not, and how the deployment of this AI strategy will change their brand. What kind of trust issues and perception issues will it bring up if it's not done mindful? And then, of course, like we mentioned at the beginning, don't forget that live prototyping, right? You have to be willing to accept some of the negative consequences. So being able to accept that feedback, take the chances, tolerate it is really essential. And then last but not least, the toolkits that are designed have to be uniquely customized to each organization. So if you try to just have a recipe and one size fits all for everybody, that's not gonna work that well usually. It's really key when you have a design thinking approach, like we started in the beginning of our presentation, to really think about every single human that will be affected within the process of deploying an AI strategy. Everybody will be somehow affected if it's done appropriately, and you want these toolkits to address that too. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have a long-term sustainable approach. So definitely, I hope that some of you were able to understand why design thinking can be helpful. And I hope that you also check us out on social media. Our chapter is led by Nicole, who's been very helpful. And we have a lot of wonderful team members who've been participating in a lot of our events. Thank you so much. We appreciate your attendance today.
Ingrid, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. I am certain the audience found it very insightful. Thank you to all of the attendees for joining today. Ingrid, do you think we have time for a question?
Yeah, if there are questions, please.
Perfect. So the first question, beyond data models and natural language processing, how will voice AI and human relationships evolve? Will we be able to trust what a smart speaker tells us? And is this good or bad?
That's a big question. It's a big question, but it's important. And I think that's exactly why, yes, I think it will play a big role. And like with everything, and our presentation highlighted that by using design thinking, you can really understand what do all the stakeholders want out of that? So there are several areas, for instance, for patients that are disabled, where natural language processing has been deployed recently to help them in the system every day so that they have 24/7 support. I don't think there's anybody that will doubt the benefit of that. Or for elderly that do not have anybody to take care of them, to provide them with some assistance. In the financial world, we've had robo-advisors that, although they were we first encountered a lot of mistrust due to the pandemic that changed the whole dynamics. They've actually been the most successful organizations that deployed robo-advisors, right? So I think you can give a lot of examples where, if it's deployed appropriately and mindfully, the beautiful augmented relationship between human and natural language processing, or any type of other robotic tools, let's say, can yield positive outcomes if it's deployed appropriately and ethically, like we discussed.
Right. All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Sure.
What is the interaction between design thinking and diversity of development teams?
Yes, I think that's
So
very important, yes. That's actually one of the reasons why I got so fascinated by design thinking, because if you don't have diversity in your development team, you'll have bias right there. So I do think it starts with, yes, having diversity in your development team. And that's why I do believe, when I've observed this being deployed appropriately, that it can yield to the highest outcomes. So I recommend that, actually, having high diversity. And when I'm talking about diversity, it's cultural diversity, professional expertise diversity, process improvement diversity, the way you're accustomed to run a project. All those can lead to better adoption and better outcomes.
Thank you, Ingrid. So that concludes our session today, Ethical AI, a design thinking perspective. Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining today. Just as a reminder, please visit the Women in AI booth and register to become a member, and follow Women in AI on social media channels for future events and updates. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you to everybody.